Good morning, everyone. Today I want to thank Mr. William Ayers Bristano for the background picture. I know it's not the one that you sent me, but what you sent me was not a picture format, so I had to look for something similar. I hope you're okay with that picture of the Dallas Cowboys, even though this is not the year to think about that. I think if you're a Cowboys fan, but let's put that aside. Anyway, one more thing is that after I complained on the last lecture that I'm running out of background pictures, all of you have rallied pretty nicely and sent me additional pictures which I will be able to use. So thank you for that. There you go. Today we'll finish the discussion about audience costs. But as usual, before that, let's do a quick review. On Tuesday, I presented the foundations of audience cost theory, mostly the idea that there are political costs for leaders who back down from promises, not necessarily just in the context of foreign policy, so promises or threats in that. There's promises overall, but it's a lot more prevalent when it comes to foreign policy. I emphasize the need to think about audience cost, not just from the leader's perspective, but from a strategic angle. So that is, how is the adversary views those costs, and how does the regime of the country that issues those kinds of threats matters? So democracies, because of the real possibility that the leader will be punished from backing down from a threat, when leaders of democracies make those threats, those are viewed as more credible threats. They are stronger signals. Then I talked a little bit more about also the motivations of the basic idea of why leaders pay those kinds of costs, and the theory and the literature mostly talks about damages to the reputation of the country, the honor, and the idea of loss in credibility. I moved then to talk a little bit about Schultz and the observation problem, the fact that audience cost is a very strong mechanism, has a very strong underlying effect on behavior, but the problem is that we cannot necessarily view that. We need to be able to see the situations where leaders back down from a promise and then they actually pay the price. And the main argument that he offers is that in those high leverage situations such as national security crises, the actual behavior that we view has already incorporated the potential audience cost. So those are going to be scenarios where the audience cost is relatively low. It's going to be very unlikely that we'll be able to see or to observe audience costs in high value. That's the main argument he offers. And then I talked about a couple of studies that offer potential measures for audience costs. How can we actually observe that element in reality? So the Potter and Baum paper talks about looking at information flows in order to understand how the public learns about foreign policy crises, and that should lead them to develop those views about criticizing the leader or not for her behavior, and the measures of information flow, as well as the dependent variable measure of crisis reciprocation. How do we actually understand that the country has actually been able to generate those audience costs because its rival in a crisis did not reciprocate to a threat? So that represents audience cost indirectly. And finally, I finished the discussion talking about the fact that audience costs may not be just unique to democracies, with the very famous piece by Professor Wicks. She unpacked autocracies, and showed us how different types of regimes, which are different dictatorships, mostly the difference between personalist or single party dictatorships, how some of them are more likely to generate audience costs, which are almost as much as democratic states are able to generate, compared to a personalist regime, for example, which find it a lot harder because, again, their survival of those leaders is a lot less in question. So if you have any concerns or questions about this basic idea of audience cost, you're more than welcome, as always, to contact me. Before I move into the second part of this topic and finish the discussion for this topic for this week, I want to do a small sidetrack and talk very briefly about the idea of application of our theories in the real world. We are approaching the 2020 elections. I will not talk about elections in those lectures because I cannot vote, so I don't want to provide my opinion in that case, and it doesn't really matter. Second thing, I'm not an expert in American politics, so I'm not going to go into the idea of the elections themselves. The main point of what I want to show you here is to provide you some potential sources where you can find some information, learn a little bit more about all those different issues that relate to the elections, and how to learn about them, not just for social media blogs and all those pundits on TV that do not necessarily have a lot of foundations to their proclamations and arguments, but actually use actual research in political science and overall in IR in order to understand some of those events. So one of the main issues that has come up when we talk about the 2020 elections is concerns about the prospect of actual violence here that's going to be around the elections. We really hope it's not going to be a part of it, but there are concerns about that, talking about that in dominant media outlets and even just around the blogosphere, we can call that. So if you press the link here, if you look at the slides after the lecture, you can go into a very short blog post by two professors who are experts in those issues, and they provide some understanding, really providing the conditions where electoral violence is more likely, how that relates to the US, and then talk a little bit about how that may actually materialize. And when it comes to the US context, beyond that specific issue which relates directly to the 2020 elections, I wanted to give you some sense of other potential sources. So the Monkey Cage blog provides a lot of very interesting short blog pieces that relate to actual events. So a couple of weeks ago, when there was when they talked about the potential plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, then one of the expert scholars, which is deals with those kinds of issues about expert in kidnapping, she wrote a small blog piece about, again, the conditions for political kidnapping and what that means and how that relates to the United States. So those issues are a lot more about how do we apply our political theories into the context of real world events, especially very recent world events. So that's the Monkey Cage blog. The only limitation you have for this one, it's part of the Washington Post, so you may have to go through the paywall. If there's issues here that you are really interested to find, you can come and talk to me. You can send me an email or come talk to me on office hours, and we'll try to overcome those. The others, for example, this is actually links. I didn't put the link for the Monkey Cage because it's going to be behind the paywall anyway, but War on the Rocks focuses on the military aspect. POV, the political violence in the glass, it's actually where you had the link for this piece. A lot of interesting small pieces about issues related to political violence, to international relations, and how they actually transpire in reality with actual events. And lastly, if you're not a big fans of reading those kinds of things, you prefer to listen to experts talking about those kinds of issues while you're working out, while you clean your house, whatever that is. So there's a couple of links here for a couple of very interesting podcasts that talk about that. And you are, I really recommend going on to listen to them. They talk about many different topics, but a lot of them actually directly relate to international relations and some of the issues we talked about in class. So that's just some additional sources that you can use, especially now when the whole political angle of the elections come into play and everything has been talked about all the time. So if you want that, if you want more, I can give you some more. You can just come and talk to me. You can find what's most interesting to you. All right. So on Tuesday, I talked about the audience cost, the theory and the foundations, but one of the main challenges that audience cost theory faces is to show, and again, I talked about it in the context of the Schultz paper and then the other paper, that these concepts actually, that audience costs actually exist in reality. We addressed several studies, the Schultz one, the Potter and Bound ones, and they relied on, first of all, they looked at overall strategic behavior by states. So how does my rival respond to my threats, considering the fact that I may back down of that threat or not? And they relied on measures which are mostly indirect, such as I said, reciprocation in conflict. Now, what I want to talk about is evidence regarding the main actors when it comes to audience cost, and that's the public, right? The public is one of the most fundamental elements in audience cost, because in order to generate those audience costs, this potential political cost for the leader, the public actually needs to make those kinds of actions. So one question that I've addressed a couple of times already in this course so far is the question says, does the opinion of the citizens matter when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to IR? So there's a lot of responses to that, but some of the most important aspects we can think about is that foreign policy issues are still important for voters. Maybe not as much as it was couple of years ago, or during the Cold War, or right after the Cold War. Maybe then foreign policy was a lot more prevalent when it comes to the public and voting behavior. But if we look at more specific aspects of foreign policy or international relations now, a lot of members of the public, a lot of citizens such as yourself, will say they care more a lot about it and think about it when they go to vote in elections, such as threats of terrorism. That may be a very important aspect of foreign policy of international relations, which does have an effect when it comes to voting. So overall, the opinion of the public matters because public eventually votes for the leader and provides support or does not provide support for foreign policy. The extent of support that leaders has important how likely it is that the leader will be able to more easily work with the parliament, such as the Congress, or in other countries, not other types of parliaments. An unpopular leader will find it harder to work with the parliament. Unpopular leader will also have negative effect on how much the legislators from its own party will also have support. So unpopular Democratic president may find it hard to provide support for Democratic nominees for Congress or for the Senate or for the House or whatever the race may be. So again, when it comes to how much does public opinion matters for foreign policy and for leaders' behavior, there is a significant effect in this case, which we should not ignore. And that's why, from a fundamental standpoint, we should care about the public when it comes to audience cost. So we begin with the first idea that you had for today in the reading list. It is the Tom's piece from a couple of years ago. This was the first work that directly assesses the extent of public opposition to leaders issuing empty threats or backing down in a crisis. And he also explored the motivations behind that. So we know that the audience cost is based on actually addressing two questions. So first, do citizens actually care about those kinds of empty threats? Do citizens reject inconsistent behavior by leaders? If a leader issues a threat and backs down, does it matter for the average citizen? And then the related question to that, if it does, how will they hold the leaders accountable? He suggests that finding evidence for audience costs within the public is important because it provides a micro foundations for a very extended class of models when it comes to IR. A lot of the behavior that we talk about in IR theories, whether it is democratic peace, whether it is domestic effects on leaders' behavior when it comes to foreign policy, even when it comes to behavior in the economic context. A lot of that relate on the idea of leaders' accountability in democratic states. If we are able to show that the public cares about inconsistent behavior, which is not unique to a national security situation, it can be for many others. We're talking about national security. But if we can find evidence that the public cares and the public will punish a leader which behaves in an inconsistent manner, that provides a very strong foundation for the whole idea behind those models, which say that leaders are accountable to the public. To test the questions, he uses an experiment. I've talked more about experiments last week when I talked about democratic peace. Reminding you again, the main benefit that the experimental methods provide us is the ability to isolate our main causal factor. So if we're talking about the potential effect that consistent or inconsistent behavior will have on the public approval of the president, either when he decides to stay out of the conflict or when then he decides to just offer an empty threat, then we can actually focus on this specific factor when we're using an experiment and keep all the other things the same. Tom's accounts for 4 different factors: the regime type of the adversary, the motivation of the adversary to begin with the attack, the relations with the United States, whether the United States is a lot more stronger than the other one or not, and whether the US has interests. Overall, they describe a situation where a foreign country invades another country, and then the United States president will have to decide whether to intervene or not, whether to issue a threat or not. And then he accounts for all those 4 factors and tests for their effect. So, and the main question that he asked in terms of the dependent variable for those experiments is how much did you approve or disapprove of the way that the president behaved? Again, in order to focus on the inconsistent behavior, one group of respondents in his survey reads that the president has decided to not intervene in the conflict and actually followed through and did not intervene, so he just stayed out of the conflict. And then he asks, what's your opinion on that action? And another group is facing the scenario of the president has made a threat to intervene in the conflict, but eventually he backed down and did not intervene. And again, what's your level of approval for that kind of behavior? So what you have here is a breakdown of public approval or disapproval of the president. I'll focus on disapproval here because it's pretty much like looking at approval, but the opposite. So a president that will decide to stay out is about 13 to 20% disapproval for this kind of action. But if that president will decide to issue a threat and then back down, then the costs are much higher. Overall, the summary in this case of the differences between the empty threat and the stay out option are 16% difference, which is a very significant one. The level of support is much lower when the president decides to back down from a threat. Okay, so that's what we have here overall. That's the main finding, and that provides us an initial evidence for the fact that if presidents or leaders issue promises and they do not follow those promises, they are likely to pay costs because the public cares about that. That's an initial evidence for audience cost. He then engages in another test. In this case, he presents different policy options. It's not about just issuing a threat and backing down. It's about issuing a threat and backing down, or issuing a threat and then actually sending forces. And he also provides an option in the experiment of issuing a threat and actually engaging in conflict. So what you see here are different types of policies and how much audience cost they generate. So in all those cases, we compare that to the option of staying out. So audience costs are higher when you're just threatening and backing down. When you're threatening and sending forces but do not engage in violence, and again, there's no difference here, but again, there are audience costs. And the most powerful cost that leaders will pay is if they will issue a threat and then use force and have casualties. So there's audience cost in that case as well. Whenever human cost or the potential of US casualties are involved, the rejection of those kinds of actions is much higher. So that's what he finds. So overall, this analysis shows that there is a general trend of disapproval for backing down. There is less criticism. There is criticism for staying out, for not intervening in the first place, but it's a lot lower. So some will disagree with the president that decides to not intervene in this kind of an international conflict, but it's going to be a lot lower than the option of an empty threat. One more thing that he explores in this analysis is, again, the question of how important are these results? Does public opinion matter? It comes back to the question I talked about a couple of minutes ago. Does public opinion matter in this case? So what he does is that he accounts for different types of respondents. Some of them are more engaged from a political standpoint, some of them are less, whether it is by voting, whether it is by participating in electoral campaigns, whether it is by going and talking about this with their neighbors, with their family, with their friends, and trying to engage convince them of different political opinions. So those are the ones who are more politically engaged. And what he finds that there is even stronger evidence for those kinds of audience cost for those who are more politically engaged, which suggests that the effect of audience cost overall may be even more important, because if those that are actually engaged in politics, that actually go to vote, that actually go and express their opinions in town hall meetings or other kinds of scenarios, if those people are even more sensitive to empty threats and backing down in a conflict situation, or to just overall leaders not keeping with their promises, then the effect of audience cost as a very basic mechanism is a lot more powerful. The final things that he tests is the idea of the motivation. What is the motivation? Why do citizens oppose this idea of backing down? He uses, other than just running it again as another experiment, he also offers open-ended questions to his respondents. And overall, he provides 3 general findings. One is that a lot of respondents said that they rejected the backing down policy because intervention was the right thing to do. So those respondents did not have any kind of concern with the idea of the backing down from commitments, so not keeping the promises, but it was mostly a moral issue that this is the right thing to do, or it was more, material issues of not intervening in this conflict might have economic or strategic or political cost for the United States. So it's not about the idea of you said you're going to do one thing and you did something else. It's more about the content of the policy itself. It was the right thing to do to intervene. In this case, you decided to not intervene. And that was the opposition. for that. He also finds that some rejected the actual initial intervention decision based on what they expressed as mostly a dovish or isolationist views. I mean, that's saying things like it's not the United States' responsibility to engage in those kinds of situations. So that was criticism, not for backing down, that was criticism for the actual initial decision to actually intervene. But overall, the largest group we have, over 70% of the respondents for those open-ended questions, they were concerned with the damage to the credibility and the reputation of the United States because of that inconsistent behavior by the president. Okay, so that's the Tom's piece. And if you read the paper and if you completed the third survey task, which the vast majority of you did complete, then some of those things that I talked about so far in the last 10, 12 minutes sound to seem relevant to you. Well, you did a survey, just like you did when I talked about last week about a survey that replicated the democratic peace experiment. What you did in your survey number three was a replication of a couple of studies that addressed public opinion and audience cost. The first thing that you did in the first part of the survey was a replication of what I talked about so far, the Tom's paper with some modification. So the survey described a conflict scenario and a decision by the president either to stay out of the conflict or issuing a threat that the United States will intervene in the conflict. Then I gave you information about whether the staying out option was indeed kept, or that the president, in the context of a threat, decided to back down from the threat. And then I asked you, how much do you approve or disapprove of such a leader? So how did you do? This is a breakdown of your results. Overall, we see that the empty threat, those who read about the president issuing a threat for United States intervention and then decided to back down, had about 75% disapproval rating. So very strong opposition to an empty threat. Staying out also collected some negative views, but a lot lower, about a little less than 50%. So overall, across the entire option of answers that you have, starting from strong approval to strong disapproval, there was, just like the previous research, just like the Tom's research has shown us, there's higher proportion of disapproval when a president engages in an empty threat. One more thing I did is that I took the data from your experiment and I plotted your responses by aggregating those that provided the different levels of approval and the approval and the different levels of disapproval. And I removed the ones that provided the neither answer because it doesn't help us in this case. And when we look at the results, again, using those two clusters of approve versus disapprove, then these results are even more powerful. Again, about 86% disapproval rating for an empty threat, and only against almost about 64% for staying out. So those results are even stronger. Now, the other condition that you had in the experiment, other than the policy action itself of empty threat versus staying out, was the power balance between the United States and the rival. So the logic behind that, and that's part of the logic that also Tom's accounts for, is that if the rival is strong, then that should have an effect on the opinion regarding whether the president should have stayed out or should have backed down. I don't have it here plotted because I didn't want to overload those slides with a lot of pictures, but what your results showed is that when the rival was weak, so when the United States was a lot more powerful than that aggressor, then the audience cost for an empty threat were a lot larger. So it was about 40% difference between an empty threat and a staying out option. Here you have about 22%. So when we are focusing also on a weak rival or not weak or a strong rival, then the difference was even larger. Now, when it was a strong rival, the audience costs were much lower, about 16%. When we compare the stay out option to the empty threat option. So overall, the bottom line of this part of the survey that you completed last week was, first of all, we were able to replicate the basic work that Professor Thoms has done, which is good for us. And we were able to understand how audience costs emerge based on those kinds of decisions by the leaders. All right, in the rest of the lecture today, I want to talk more about the idea of the audience cost in the context of the public, but putting a little bit more nuance on different elements. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to start by digging a little bit deeper and talk about more specific elements of the audience cost mechanism when we think about using individual level responses by the public in order to test those mechanisms. So we're talking about the paper by Lewandowski and Horowitz, who are, both of them are professors at the University of Pennsylvania. They explore domestic politics and how are these factors may shape audience cost when we're facing a crisis or a conflict situation. There's how are those different. They talk about three factors, which I'm going to expand about in a minute, but they talk about how those three factors may actually change the extent of audience costs facing a national security crisis. All right, so what are they talking about? The first factor they talk about is elite reactions. Past work in international relations overall and foreign policy suggests that the reaction by the opposition, members of the opposition elites, is critical to understand the concept of resolve. The argument in this case is if the president described some kind of behavior. Now, if the opposition party are also backing the decision by the leader, then that should represent a strong, credible signal on the intentions on the country. So if the president decides to, before we're talking about audience cost now, overall in a security crisis or in a security situation, if the president decides to send the military forces, if the opposition parties support the president for that, that should provide a very strong, credible signal for the rival that the country is, the intentions of the country in this case are serious and the threat of using force is not a bluff. So that's the idea behind the effect of elite reactions. Now, if we apply that logic to audience cost, this is pretty much the same idea, especially when it comes to crisis situations, because early on in a crisis situations, elites, doesn't matter if they are from the government or from the opposition, will have a substantial information advantage when it comes to the public. They will know more about the security conflict or the crisis more than the public before the public begins to learn from that. So the action of those elites, whether they oppose or support the action of the president, in this case, is an important and a strong signal for the public about how they should think about the behavior of the government. So again, there's two possible options. The more common one is the split along party lines. So if the president is on one party, then the elites from his party will support the threat or the decision to stay out, and the elites from the opposition will reject, and that's the more common one. What the authors in this paper suggest is that it's less common to have this kind of split in a security context, because in many cases those kinds of scenarios are framed as a crisis which are relevant for everyone because it's the national interest of everyone to address this crisis. So that's one option. The other option is having a consensus when elites from both parties will back the president's decision to back down. We're focusing about how it likely is going to affect audience costs. So if the president decides to back down and he gets the support of both his party members as well as the opposition, that should send a strong signal to the public that we're facing here a national crisis and this is a choice that everyone accepts and the president should not be punished for his empty threat in this case. That's the idea behind elite reactions. Second factor is partisanship. By default, we may assume that audience costs are imposed based upon the party's the political affiliation of the president. But again, there's two arguments that the authors present here. The first is that security crises are a little different because they're more immediate, and those immediate effects of a crisis or the immediate threat reduces the effects of long-term existing dispositions such as partisanship. Also, security crises tend to enhance a national rather than partisan identity, which again reduces the effect of partisanship. The other point here is that public opinion will be strongly influenced by elite framing led by presidents. And when the president can frame the conflict situation or the crisis as we need to address that because this is a national interest, or we decided not to engage in the conflict because it was the national interest, that should have an effect on the public regardless of the partisanship of the president. Overall, their expectation is that partisanship will have a very weak effect because of those conditions related to a security crisis. The third part is what's called the justification by the president. So if the president is able to present new information that justify the decision to back down, that should have an effect on audience cost. The logic is that this new information will show the voters, will show the citizens that by not following on the threat, the president actually saved the country from paying unnecessary cost in terms of human life, in terms of economic cost, in terms of international credibility. And all that saving of cost for the country by backing down after you already issued a threat, all that will make that leader appear more competent and should reduce also the audience cost. That's the idea behind new information to justify the decision. So those are the three factors they account for, and they test that also with an experiment, also providing the same idea as we talked about for your survey task, as well as the Tom's survey task, a crisis, and whether the president decides to back down or stay out. So first of all, what are those different effects, those domestic political effects have on the approval of the president, which is the main quantity that we test here. So what you have here is on the y-axis, we have the probabilities, or the approval percentage, I'm sorry, for the president based on those different situations. So the baseline condition is the back down condition, so issuing a threat and then backing down. So as you see, the level of approval is very, very low. But what happens when the president backs down but provides new information? Look at the jump at the number of the extent of approval for the president once he's able to present new information to justify the decision to back down. Now, the opposite of that is when the president just does not back down, but he just decides to stay out, and then you have a relatively high level of approval in this case. We also have here the effect of the elites. So if only the president's party will support the decision to back down, that there's about a little less than 25% approval. But what happens when both parties support them, when there is a consensus by both parties in the American context for the decision to back down, then again, the audience costs are lower because the percentage of approval for the president is higher. That's what they show here in this figure and the results. They also run a bunch of regression models, and overall they find support for the factor of new information as well as elite views, as you saw in the figure. Partisanship at the same time has a very limited effect. Those results overall reinforce the findings that Tom's had regarding the reputational aspect as justifying audience cost. And finally, they run an analysis which is based on what's called mediation analysis, which is another method which allows to account for indirect effects of one factor on some outcome. And what they find is that approval rating are mediated by the views of how competent is the president. So the situation itself, the backing down or the staying out, has an effect on how competent the president appeared, and that has its own effect on the approval of the president. So the effect of the situation, of the decision by the president to back down or to stay out, is mediated by the views of the public of how competent is the president. So it's additional aspects related to the process of how audience costs are formed. So that's the Horowitz and Lewandowski work, which again provides a little bit more nuance to different elements related to audience cost. And now I want to get back to your survey again. The second decision task that you faced asked for your approval for another types of conflict, but this time the behavior by the president was overall there were two options that some of you have read about. One option, some of you read about the other one. One of them was that the president promised to stay out, but he broke that promise and eventually decided to engage in the conflict. The other group was the more common types of breaking a promise, which was a promise to intervene, but then backing down from that promise. Another element that was incorporated into that part of the survey, which you can now understand where it came from the Lewandowski and Horowitz paper, was some of you have read a script which provides new information that justified either choice, so either to stay out and then intervene eventually, or to back down after reaching a threat. So there was new information to justify that. Some of you did not have that information. That's, again, reminding you the idea behind the experimental work that allows me to control whether that new information has an effect on your choice. So again, let's talk a little bit about some of the results. Again, this is the entire sample, all of you. The extent of disapproval for empty threat, just like you saw in the first part of the survey, and the Tom's piece, and the Horowitz and Lewandowski piece, high degree of disapproval for backing down, about 74%. At the same time, for what is termed backed in, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but the other option, again, was that the president promised to stay out, but eventually decided to intervene. That's the backed in option. There's actually about 47 to 48% approval for that kind of choice, which is interesting in showing that this is just another version of inconsistency, right? Because this is the most classic inconsistency we talked about. This is another version of inconsistency. This time, you said you're going to stay out, but you decided to intervene eventually. It's also inconsistent behavior, but the level of opposition or approval for that are very, very different. So what we see here that the level of opposition for the backing in option, which again is another version of inconsistency, is a lot lower. It's about 13-14% compared to about 74%. And that's across the entire sample. Now, what I did again is, I aggregated your responses, those that said some or strong disapproval, and those that said some and strong approval, and removed the ones who offered the neither option. And then I also incorporated into the next figure the effect of the new information. And that's what we have here. As you can see, we have two plots that represents the empty threat option and two plots that represent the backed in option. And then we have separating between those that did not read about information justifying the choice and those that did. And the most clear thing we can take out of here is look at the powerful effect that providing information that's going to justify the decision has. Providing new information to justify the decision to go back into the conflict after promising to stay out led to a 30% increase in the approval of that decision. In terms of criticism on the president's empty threat, it actually also has a positive effect because providing information to justify the decision to stay out of the conflict after initially promising to intervene led to almost about 10% drop in the disapproval rating. So new information is very powerful in supporting and affecting audience costs in that case. So, and again, overall, those results also provide evidence for the previous types of finding that you had here, that an empty threat is encountered with a high degree of opposition or audience cost when it comes to the public, but a backing in option, so the different types of inconsistency, actually is supported on some level by the public. The last thing I did is based on the question that you had, after you read the scenario, you have expressed your opinion, whether you approve or disapprove of the president's action, whatever the actions were. I asked you a series of questions about how do you think that kind of choice by the president had an effect on the credibility, the reputation of the United States, and that's what I want to show you now. That's in terms of looking at the motivations for audience cost. So here we compare the negative effect of inconsistency, and that's across both types of inconsistency. And that's where I separated them. So for backing down, for issuing a threat and then backing down from the threat, the damage to reputation was very, very high. The damage to reputation from promising to stay out but eventually deciding to intervene was a lot lower. Similarly, the damage to the United States credibility was also about 90% damaging when it comes to backing down, issuing a threat, and not following through, compared to backing in, promising to stay out, but eventually deciding to intervene. Similar trends we see also when it comes to the president incompetence. A president that declares she will not intervene in the conflict, eventually decides to send military forces, has a 30% in terms of how incompetent she looks. So she looks very incompetent in this case. No, I'm sorry, 30% that she looks incompetent, but not as much as a president which issues a threat and decides to back down, which is a lot more powerful in this case. So the bottom line of this overall, the survey, first of all, as you can see, your results were very interesting and very fun to play with. We were able to replicate first of all, we were able to replicate the Tom's paper. In the second part, which is as talked about now, we were able to replicate the Lewandowski and Horowitz paper. And as I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, another paper, which I'm going to get to in a second. And we saw the important effect that providing new information has on audience cost. The last thing that we can take out of your survey is understanding that inconsistency has, on some level, we can call that inconsistency has many faces. And I want to probe a little bit more on that aspect. All right, so when we're focusing on the aspect of inconsistency when it comes to the audience cost argument, the most basic formulation of the theory, public criticism or public opposition or the political cost for political leaders, is due to the fact that they made statements or threats in a crisis and failed to keep them. And this inconsistent behavior by political leaders leads to negative views of those leaders because the public is concerned about reputation and credibility and those kinds of actions. However, just as you saw in the survey that you were completing last week, there is another angle for inconsistency. Whether we are going to punish the leader for promising to remain out of conflict, but then changing course and going back in. And the example that I have here is President Lincoln and the events in the first half of his first year in office, actually, 1861. In his inauguration speech in early 1861, Lincoln promised not to invade the South and not to use force against the population in the South. Now, after the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861, he imposed a blockade and reassured to some members of the Congress, especially members that were members of the Southern state, that he's committed to the non-invasion policy. However, by the end of June 1861, he shifted course and he attacked Virginia. The Union actually suffered a loss in that specific conflict. It was the Battle of Manassas. I hope I'm spelling it correctly. And the president then was compelled to sign a law that required recruiting soldiers into the Union Army. Regardless of this entire piece of American history, this case nicely illustrates the other aspect of inconsistency. So Lincoln promised that he's gonna refrain from invasion or attack states in the South, and he broke that promise and he backed himself into a conflict. So the concept of backing into a conflict is coming from a paper by Levy and his associates. He's a professor at the University of Rutgers and a few others. They focus on comparing the classic inconsistency or inconsistency when it comes to backing down to the idea of backing in. So promise to stay out, but eventually decide to back in. Their basic argument is that consistency, or actually the lack of consistency, is one of the basic foundations of the audience cost theory. Regardless if the public motivations for rejecting the president's behavior is reputation, resolve, credibility, whatever that is, the idea of inconsistent behavior is a foundational aspect of audience cost. As a result, if domestic punishment for backing down, so for issuing a promise and not following through on the promises, if domestic punishment for those kinds of action is driven in part by the fact that the public opposes the concept of inconsistency, then this punishment should also be relevant for leaders who are also failing to honor their promises to stay out. You can view that as negative commitments, right? Because they committed to stay out, but eventually they decided to intervene. So again, the domestic punishment that is more prevalent or more easier for us to think about when a leader issues a threat and then backs down should also work for a leader who issues a promise to stay out of the conflict and then decides to go back in. They describe that by using the basic game setting of the interaction between a challenger and his rival in a conflict. If you remember when I talked on Tuesday about the basic formulation of an audience cost from a strategic stance using the game theory model that Schultz talked about. So again, this is pretty much similar. This is the decision by the United States government. So everything that we have here on this node, we're already familiar with when I talked about it from the Schultz piece, issuing a threat. And then if the rival decides to oppose the threat, the United States should decide whether they want to use force, which is consistent with the threat, or to display inconsistency by backing down from the threat, and that's backing out of the threat. Now, what they do is that they expand this node of staying out. The choice is not just, I promised I will stay out of the conflict. Then the US government faces another choice, whether they want to be consistent with that promise and actually stay out, or they want to break the promise and actually go back in, and that's use force after promising to stay out. So that's the other formulation of audience cost. The argument is if the domestic audience will value consistency as a sign for the competence of the leader, as we saw in all other studies before this one, then they should be just as likely to punish the leader that decides to follow that path and end in this situation, the B option here, and back again. And that's what they call inconsistency cost. So what do they find? They use also an experiment. Part of their experiment was incorporated into the survey task that you completed last week. They find that inconsistency leads to higher audience cost. So there's a loss of about 22% in approval for backing out of a crisis after a threat compared to doing nothing. So the basic idea of audience cost that we had so far, backing down after issuing a threat, leads to a 22% loss in approval. There is a similar loss, even though a little bit smaller, when it comes to using force after promising to stay out. So this new type of inconsistency that I've talked about, this backing in option, promise to stay out, but eventually decide to go back in, also ends with a loss in approval, but a lot smaller. They also test for the effect of new information, showing that new information has a positive effect on reducing the extent of audience cost, just like you had in your own survey when I presented new information, especially when it comes to the backing in decision. So again, promising to stay out, but eventually deciding to intervene. When I present new information to justify that, then there was actually a reward for the leader that decided to back out in your case. For their experiment was rewarding the leader for backing out. So which again, you also had that, a drop in the level of disapproval when new information is an option. And again, they also show that a lot of the motivations for those costs, both types of costs, is the idea of competence, reputation, and credibility. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is to explore another angle which relates to inconsistency, but this time we are focusing on the initial decision to intervene. So what Levy and his associates did in their paper was to focus on the decision to stay out. What we have here now is the study by Kurtzer and Bradker, also from a couple of years ago, and their focus is the initial decision to intervene. Should the president do this kind of statement in the first place? What their argument is that we need to look a lot more closely at the type of costs which are associated with the classic inconsistency problem. So it's not just the inconsistency between threats and backing down, or even the backing in option. It is also the initial decision to intervene. Once a statement has been made, it represents a sunk cost, and that's what they call a belligerent cost. Because once an actual threat has been made, it creates expectations, and therefore it carries a potential cost. Even if the statement says that the United States will not intervene, it has a cost, because if you're not following through on that, you have a cost for that. So the idea is to focus on the initial statement made by the president. That's what they argue. They suggest we should view audience cost as what they term it as a double-barrel gun, which consists of two types of costs in this case. According to their argument, audience costs are a function of the decision to back down, so issuing the threat and backing down, or in addition to the decision to actually issue a threat. This is one part of the audience cost, minus what they view as the control condition when there is no threat at all, or there is a threat and there is an employing force. So there is a consistent, either there is no threat at all and there is a consistent behavior, so the president issued a threat and actually used force. This is the control part of this audience cost. And the initial part of that is, again, the ones that we're more familiar with, backing down after issuing a threat, or just issuing a threat to use force, which is part of the belligerence cost. So these are the two combined factors that make the observed measure of audience cost view as either inconsistency as well as belligerence. So those are the two elements that are comprised of audience cost: the initial decision to make a statement, whether to intervene or not, as well as the behavior regarding backing down or not. Now, focusing for a few short seconds on the concept of belligerence costs, they explain the fact that those costs are based on the fact that some citizens oppose the use of force of IR in general, not just because they are members of some party or support some party, and the party that they are supporters of is not in the government. For example, some are concerned about negative effects of escalation because of using force in the international context. Some of them are prefer to engage in a more isolationist approach, focus on domestic issues. So overall, those kinds of citizens view the initial decision to issue a threat as costly because that serves the motivation for them to oppose the president. They didn't want to intervene in the first place. So by having by having made this kind of threat, the president already faces a potential cost. Now, one more thing that they focus in this paper, which is relatively new when it comes to research on audience cost, is looking at the audience itself. They term that as, let's bring the audience back into audience cost. The argument is that the rational models, which are the foundation for a lot of those, for this whole theory, will assume that all members of the public have the same view of the security context, or at least the average view of the public will be able to cancel out all those outlier cases of extreme views to one side or the other. In the vast majority of studies of audience costs before that work by Kurtzer and Brutger, it does not focus on the idea of individual differences between members of the public, and they view the public in a much more homogeneous way, which is actually the opposite of the way that the public is viewed when it comes to public opinion research, because in public opinion research, we should focus on potential differences or potential different characteristics of the public and how are those different characteristics may matter for their opinion when it comes to resolve, or in this case, audience cost. So in order to account for the heterogeneous audience, they use different measures. For example, they ask questions when it comes to viewing military as the most viable foreign policy option. You had that question as well. I did not talk about it in the results because it was not really have an effect in your case, but this is one way they account for it. They also collect information regarding international trust. So the different levels of international trust within the public will have effects on the proposed cost, because those who are high or international trust will care more about the belligerence cost because they trust other people. So they don't think the country needs to intervene in the first place, for example. The idea of nationalism is linked to normative concerns about national honor or in-group identity. And the expectations here that those who are more high on nationalism should also display more concern about inconsistency. And lastly, it's political ideology, and that's where conservatives are more likely to display or to seek order, structure, and consistency, while liberals care more about the actual use of force. So they will be not that concerned when it comes to inconsistency, the other types of cost. Before I get to the results and finish for today, I'll stop for today's attendance word. The attendance word for today is the word well, like in well done. So well is the attendance word for today. So what do Kurtzer and Brutger find? So first, overall, like all the previous work when it comes to audience cost and public opinion, they found that backing down, so the very basic formulation of audience cost, the president issues a threat and then decides to back down, has a negative effect of almost 1.5 points when it comes to approval. So that's, again, another evidence supporting the public angle of audience cost. Then they decompose the audience cost based on their theoretical argument that it includes both the inconsistency element as well as the belligerence element. And they find that inconsistency is still the more powerful part of their of audience cost. It accounts for about 67% of the total effect. But belligerence cost also matters, and it counts about a third of it. And what I want to show, so that suggests, first of all, that suggests that overall both types of costs matter. So when we think about audience cost, we should not think about just inconsistency, but other aspects when it comes to it. So in this case, what they term belligerence cost. And now what you have here is a display of those two elements of audience cost, belligerence and inconsistency, as the way that they can be broken down based on the different individual characteristics of the audience. So for example, you can see the clear difference here between those who are high to those who are low on the militant aspect, so using military as the most common foreign policy options. Those who are high care a lot more about inconsistency compared to belligerence, and the opposite are to those who are low. Similarly, we have here for the international trust. Those who are high international trust put a lot more emphasis on the belligerence cost aspect of an audience cost compared to the inconsistency cost. Which shows by basically what it shows is the public or the audience is a lot more diverse than we previously assumed in those models. And some people care more about inconsistency. We can think about that, all the hawks here, or the conservatives. In this case, you can see again, the conservatives care more about inconsistency. The differences is not that big, but again, it provides us some kind of a preliminary evidence for that. And some care more about belligerence, such as liberals or those who are more of a dove kind of ideology. The general implications that they offer, first of all, as they suggested in the first place, audience cost has a sunk cost component. It's not just the tying hands mechanism of issuing a threat and then backing down, which has a cost for the president, and also has an effect when it comes to serving as a signal to the rival. Audience costs also include the basic aspect of a sunk cost from actually making the threat to begin with. Some public members, when we look at the public in a more heterogeneous way, some public members will oppose the choice even before the inconsistency part of audience cost takes place. From a signaling perspective, so when we look at the different effects of the audience, it is not just the leader and the decisions made by the leader, so issuing a threat or not issuing a threat, it's also the opinion of the public and the different characteristics of the public which matter in terms of what types of signal is being set and how the adversaries, which are we face in that kind of situation, will interpret that from the perspective of audience cost. So it's not just looking at the leader the way that the rational choice models and the basic formulation of audience cost theory proposes that. We also should think about the public and the variations we have between members of the public. Okay, so that's what I have for today. That's finishing the topic of audience cost. That's finishing a discussion about your third survey task. And with that, next week we'll have a new topic. And with that, I will finish for today. And I will see you on Tuesday. Bye, everyone.